Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for joining our diagnostic training session today. Now, this week, it is a pre-recorded session, so if you do have any questions, if you're watching on Zoom, you can reply to the confirmation email you got. That'll go to my email box, and then I'll respond to those when I get back from traveling. If you're watching this on YouTube, just leave a comment under the video. Same thing. I'll get to those when I get back. And then on Facebook, you can just leave a comment underneath as well, and then I will get to those at the end of the session as well. So my name is Jason Gabrinas. I'm one of Snap-on's National Diagnostic Technical Trainers. Been in the training department the last 9 years or so, traveling around North America, helping techs and shop owners get the most out of their diagnostic equipment. Before I did that, it was a couple of years as a diagnostic sales rep at Snap-on. So I had about 30 different Snap-on franchisees I worked with, as well as the shops that they serviced in order to help everyone get the most out of their diagnostic needs. And before that, it was 8 years at Subaru. So I worked at a dealership and over time, I guess, became the default diag guy in the shop. So I always ended up with the drivability problems, the intermittent problems, the weird wiring problems that would show up on those cars. And that's really where I learned a lot about diagnostics and developed a lot of my techniques and learned a lot about it, as I said. So before that, bunch of other miscellaneous wrenching jobs. Been about 25 years under hood experience for me. So our topic today is approach to intermittent problems. So if we think about, those intermittent problems can be some of the more difficult head scratcher type issues that we could have on a vehicle. And it could be a code. We could still have a code involved. At least we get a starting point at that point. Or maybe we have no code, right? So we want to think about what can we do using the tools that we already have to maybe help us out with that. So we'll talk about freeze frames. So if you were with us at the very beginning, I showed a little video on some multiple freeze frames. So that's a little bit of a teaser is what we're going to talk about a little bit later. But freeze frames just one aspect of that. And talk about fuel trims, right? There seems to be a little bit of mystery surrounding what fuel trims are and how they work and how we can use them to help us. So we'll talk a little bit about that. We'll also talk about catalyst efficiency. If I have a catalytic converter that might be on its way out, but it hasn't reached the threshold enough to maybe set a code, or maybe if it has set a cat code and I want to see, is it actually the cat is the problem or is it something else? Because we know not always a PO420 code is a catalyst problem. Sometimes it could be oxygen sensor related. Sometimes it could just be an exhaust leak, right? So we can be able to see how that catalyst is performing by using scan data. Then we'll go live on the tool. We'll talk about a few of those things we talk about in the first part, right? The freeze frame and the data stream, right? And then we will go into intermittent body problems, right? So we always talk about intermittent engine problems and drivability issues and this and that, but what if I have a problem in my body control circuits? We can still use our scan tool for body stuff too. So splitting the circuit in half, really using functional tests and interpreting the data that we're seeing in order to diagnose a possible body problem. So we'll walk through a little scenario on that as well. So first up is freeze frame. Now, what is freeze frame? We don't talk about it, at least through our classes, we don't talk about it, I think, as much as we probably should. But freeze frame is a snapshot of what the vehicle was doing at the time a fault occurs. So when I set a code, what was going on with the vehicle? Was it fully up to temperature? Was the was the temperature 60 degrees? Was it first startup? Was it an hour later? What was the throttle position? What was the engine load like? What were my fuel trims like? We'll talk more about that as we go on. But you can see what was the car doing at the time of the fault in order to perhaps duplicate that issue with the car. So when you're driving, if it's an intermittent issue, I can duplicate that scenario and see what's going on. All right, so we're going to walk through real quick this little case study. This is something that actually happened to me. I actually experienced it, and it was a little strange, and it always stuck in my mind, this one experience. So I wanted to share it with you. So it's a 2008 Subaru Impreza STI, right? So that's their, basically a street legal race car, right? 300 horsepower and, all the fancy doodads on it to make it go faster from the factory. So the customer complaint was a stumble under a load and a flashing check engine light. So what is a flashing check engine light? That's, a catalyst damaging event, usually a misfire. In this case, no engine light was currently on, so we could have really no indication on the dash that there was any problem with the vehicle. But there were history codes when we went and scanned it, so we checked and found multiple misfire codes, such as PO302, PO303. Problem being, we go through and we do the road test on the vehicle and we check it all out and see, could not duplicate the concern no matter what we did on the road. Also, no other issues with the vehicle found. So we had no fuel issues, it wasn't like a clogged fuel filter or bad fuel pump, or didn't have any spark plug issues or coil issues, and no mechanical issues with the engine to speak of either. So really, we found no reason why this should be having this complaint. So we said, well, let's look at the freeze frame data to see what were the conditions with this vehicle when that happened. So this is a recreation of that because this was like 10 years ago when this happened, but it was very much looked like this, right? So we have the freeze frame captured from the conditions of the vehicle when this happened. And just looking at this list, now there's more than what'll fit on one page. We can scroll down and we can see multiple pages of data as to what was going on with the vehicle. But there are three things on the screen that really stick out in my mind if I was just going to take a glance at this. So first off, engine speed, 6,200 on a 6,500 RPM red line. Throttle position, 100%. Vehicle speed, 101 miles an hour. So what do we think might have been happening? I'm not entirely sure what might have been happening with this vehicle, but it's definitely operating outside of where I would be able to safely, as a technician, operate it on the road to duplicate those conditions. More than likely, maybe it was a fuel delivery problem at that point at the high RPM. Maybe spark was breaking down at such a high RPM. Maybe the valves were floating, because that's a very high RPM with a very high load on that engine. Maybe those springs couldn't get those valves closed fast enough in order to keep the compression inside the cylinder enough, right? That is a possibility of things that could happen. So we pretty much told the customer, well, we can't duplicate this situation. You're asking this to be covered under warranty, by the way. So I don't think that's going to work either. Under all normal operating conditions we could possibly operate this vehicle under, it is working fine. So in this case, we just sent the customer on their way and said, you know what, let's just maybe take it a little easier with the car and we won't have that situation happen, right? So it was just a weird oddball thing that happened, but we figured it out just by looking at that freeze frame data. It's like, whoa, hey, this is really sticking out in my head here as to what the problem is. And like I said, 10 years later, it's still in there and I still remembered it. So I figured I'd share that story with you. These are the types of things we can tell. Now, obviously, it's not always going to be that extreme, right? It could be something like, well, the code set and the coolant temp sensor was -40. All right, usually when a coolant temp sensor fails or something in the circuit fails, it'll fail to -40 degrees, but it doesn't always show a code, right? So we might not have that as an issue, right? So we can just take a look and see what was going on with the vehicle. Was it just started? Was it later on? And then if you were here at the very beginning, I showed a video talking about multiple freeze frame, but even if you weren't here, we're going to talk about it anyways. Right, so multiple freeze frame, a few different manufacturers have this available in their vehicles. So Toyota and Lexus are the big ones. Mitsubishi also has it. There's a couple other automotive manufacturers, and I know Harley Davidson also has it, and we support that with the software. Also, if you saw the video, this has been in our software for 5 years now. It's back in 2015 when this came in. So multiple freeze frame. So here we are on a 2016 Toyota Camry with a 6-cylinder. And if we look through the list, we said codes only, clear codes, data display, and there is a separate function access for freeze frame. Right, so we can go into freeze frame and then it will display the 2 codes that we have in this particular case. So we'll highlight the codes. Now these screenshots are off an Apollo D9. All the tools would have this function, it just might be in a different spot. So if we look up here on the top right-hand corner, after I have this code highlighted, we have this little squiggly line with a wrench. Right, and then on the Windows-based tools, it looks like a film strip, but it'll be, it'll be available on the screen. And if I were to click on that, it gives us a little intro as to what's going on with these multiple freeze frames. So the ECM records engine conditions in the form of freeze frame data. Some codes will store 5 separate sets of freeze frame data as follows, and these are at half-second intervals. So 3 data sets before the DTC was stored, so it'll be freeze frame -1, -2, and -3. So half a second before, a second before, and then 1.5 seconds before. 1 data set when the DTC was stored, so at the point of the fault when they kicked on the engine light or set the code, that'll be freeze frame 0, and then another one half a second after the fact, so that'll be freeze frame +1. So this will allow us to see what was going on up until that code happened. Were the throttle inputs the same? Was the load the same? Were the oxygen sensors reading the same? fuel trims, what have you. Then we see what happens to cause the code. And then after that code set, did the conditions change? Did they go along with the code and did they stay that way, or did they go back to normal, right? Because those intermittent problems can be a fraction of a second, right? So being able to see this information on the screen all at once, well, that can save a ton of time trying to figure out what the conditions were. So if we hit continue, once again, it just gives us a little bit more of a breakdown as to what we're going to see on the screen, right? So 0, +1, -1, -2, -3. And on the Apollo D9, at least, we actually can see this all on one screen. We don't have to tab through individual screens. We can see it as individual columns here. Now, this is just the demo data, dummy data on the screen here. So a lot of that says not available just because we weren't hooked up to a real car in this case. But you see the -3, and then you can compare all the data, the -2, compare all the data, -1, et cetera, and see what that vehicle was doing up until the time where that code set and even after the code set. So that could help in some of those intermittent problem diagnoses. Now let's talk about fuel trims. Fuel trims could be a clue as we're looking at the freeze frame, but they also can be a clue by themselves as we're looking at the data stream. So it seems like, go out there, talking to folks out there in the shops and such, there seems to be still a little bit of mystery around what fuel trim is and how it works. I'm going to try and keep it, nice and simple, nice and easy, so we can kind of all be on the same page as to what it is. But ideally, when a vehicle is running, we want to keep a perfectly stoichiometric air-fuel ratio of 14.7 to 1. That is what we're shooting for. That's what we're ideally, air-to-fuel ratio. We want a 14.71 parts air to 1 part of fuel. So as we're driving along down the road, whatever the conditions are, if the oxygen sensor, the front oxygen sensor is going to monitor this, if it notices too much fuel, that would be a rich condition, right? So if the oxygen sensor goes rich, it will send a command to pull fuel. So a negative fuel trim number you would see. So you'd see a negative fuel trim percentage. So it says pull fuel away. I'm seeing too much. It's rich. Then it'll pull so much fuel that then the oxygen sensor will then read lean. And it'll say, okay, now we don't have enough fuel. So we'll send a command to say increase the fuel trim. So you'll see a positive number, +2%, +4%, whatever that happens to be. Then it'll go too far the other way, and then the cycle repeats. So, oh, now I'm too rich, and then I'll come back, right? So it just goes back and forth. If we've just cleared the memory on the vehicle, if we've just cleared any of that out, the swings will be a lot wider than after I've been driving the car for a month, and then maybe those, they'll come a lot more in line. Maybe you only see a couple percent on either side of zero, just as it keeps it going. Because as conditions change in the car, of course, it needs to learn, and it needs to figure out what's going on with it. So that's kind of how it cycles. And then how do we feed into where does short-term fuel trim and long-term fuel trim relate to this? So as we said, the oxygen sensor will be sensing what's going on. Do I have too much fuel? Do I not have enough fuel? Then the oxygen sensor commands the short-term fuel trim to make a change. Short-term, like now, right? We want you to make I'm reacting, I see this information, you need to change. And then the short-term fuel trim will change accordingly. Over time, those short-term fuel trim changes, let's say it's 5%, 6% plus on my short-term fuel trim, +6%. Over a few seconds of time, then the long-term fuel trim will start adjusting that back up because they think, oh, well, now this is what normal is, right? So now we need to adjust, and then this is going to be our normal baseline. So now maybe it's 5% all the time. And then the short-term fuel trim adjusts based on that 5%. Right, so oxygen sensor feeds the short-term. Short-term makes your quick adjustments. Long-term learns what the short-term is doing over time to try and adjust the fuel to overall vehicle operation to still get that 14.7 to 1. So to see this, kind of visualize what we're talking about and what we would see on the screen as far as the scan tool, we're going to do a little exercise here. So we went out, we created a vacuum leak. So what we did is on the intake manifold, they have that big hose that goes back to the brake booster. So we slowly pulled that off to introduce a small vacuum leak and gradually increase the size. If you pull the whole thing off at once, the engine will die. So we didn't want to do that. We went off nice and slow. And we looked at the O2 sensors. And what is their relationship to the fuel trims? Things happen in a set order when it comes to this. And then we'll repair the vacuum leak, put the hose back on, and then see how it corrected itself, right? So we took a data shot, and here's the data recording of this event where it happened. So the blue line on the screen right now is where we started removing the hose. You can see prior to this, we were around like maybe 0 or 1% short-term fuel trim. Oh, by the way, let me back up here for a second. Let me tell you what you're looking at. So top one here is the rear oxygen sensor. That is a zirconia oxygen sensor. It's on the back end of the cat. After the catalytic converter is done with what it does. This is behind there, right? So it's used to monitor cats. It also affects the fuel trims in a way. Normally, on a normal running engine, this is at idle. On a normal running engine, it should be on the higher side, right? That indicates a richer condition, right? So it should be on the higher side, though. On this vehicle, it has an air-fuel ratio sensor for the front. So they call that an AF sensor, air-fuel ratio sensor, what have you. Ideally, that should be at 1, right? If it goes up, it is lean. If it goes down, it is rich. It's detecting, and it's usually within about a 0.5 volt swing on either side. It's not a very big range that it operates in. It operates down to 10, tenths, hundredths of a volt. So we can see that here reflected on there. So that's an AF sensor, lambda sensor. Ideally, you'd want to see also 1 there would be ideal. Zirconia sensor goes from about 100 millivolts up to 0.9 of a millivolt generally. Air fuel correction on a Subaru, since this is a 2011 Subaru, air fuel correction is what Subaru calls short-term fuel trim. And then air fuel learning is what Subaru calls long-term fuel trim, right? So the correction, it's correcting that short-term fuel trim, it's making corrections. And then it feeding the long-term fuel trim, which is learning what's going on with the fuel, right? So it kind of makes sense to me. It seems like a logical way to label it. Maybe it might have been better to call it correction and learning it, way back in the day when they came up with this. But hey, I digress. It's okay. But just so you know, because I've had people ask me that too, is I can't find short-term and long-term fuel trim on this Subaru. Well, they call it something different because Subaru decides to call things really weird stuff. Never mind about that. But so we got our oxygen sensors and we have our fuel trims. So this blue line is the point where we started disconnecting that hose, slowly but surely opening up that hole. So you can see my air fuel ratio sensor does react slightly. I do have a bit of ups and downs, and it starts creeping its way up. The correction, the short-term fuel trim, starts creeping its way up as well. So we're at 2%, 3%, 4%, 5%. And then we let it sit for a minute, and then it started, and then we really took it off, and it went all the way up to positive 35%. So that was a very lean condition. You also see the front oxygen or front AF sensor reacts first, then the rear oxygen sensor reacts second. You'll also see the short-term fuel trim reacts first, and then as we go up, the long-term fuel trim starts to react as well as it goes up through. And then it stayed up here for a little while, so we're 4, 5, 6, 7, about 6% right here for the long period. And then when we put the hose back on, corrected the vacuum leak, notice the front sensor goes boom, just goes right into the basement. Goes all the way down to, it looks like negative or 0.84. Right, so that's on the other side of 1. That indicates a rich condition because we were just dumping fuel in there to compensate for that lean condition that it was detecting, right? Plus 35% over what we normally had. And then it's still pumping that plus 35% in there for a little while until it decides, oh, well, hey, let's pull back some of that fuel. And then the short-term fuel trim ends up going negative right here. We have negative 4% short-term fuel trim there after we reinstalled it, and then it slowly works its way back up to 0. You'll also notice when this short-term fuel trim is at negative, my long-term fuel trim had just adjusted its way up to the max in this case at 7%. So you see how the long-term fuel trim lags behind the short-term fuel trim, because the short-term fuel trim is your quick adjustment. Your long-term fuel trim is learning what is going on with the engine and adjusting accordingly. And we can see how the front sensor feeds that as well. All right, so hopefully that made sense for you. So we want to use this to our advantage. We can use these percentage numbers to our advantage. So we want to look at the long-term fuel trim results to see, have I had an ongoing issue with this vehicle? You can also look at the short-term fuel trims and use this rule of thumb I'm about to show you to compensate or to see how the vehicle's compensating while it's, say, idling or driving. Right. So first off, green light, we're looking good at plus or minus 5%. Short-term fuel trim plus or minus 5% is normal running operation. Long-term fuel trim, if it's around that plus or minus 5%, the engine is working properly. It's within the set parameters.
Where we start to worry is if we get over 5%, and really when we get into the double digits, up to 19% plus or minus. That means it is compensating for something that we don't know what it might be. It could be a vacuum leak. It could be some sort of a wear and tear item. Could be a clogged fuel filter. Not really sure. But that would mean let's investigate what this problem is, because this vehicle is not running optimally. Something is affecting this vehicle, and we just need to figure out what. But at least we know if it's a rich or a lean condition where we would want to look, right? And then finally, red light. At this point, you would have an engine light too to refer to. So anything greater than 20% my long term, I have had this problem for a while, and it is a major problem. If I have plus or minus 20% on my short term, I have that problem right now, and it's really trying to fix it. So that means it's going to increase over the emission standards that the manufacturer needs to meet, and then it'll set a code, either rich or lean, depending on what side it is, and then turns on the engine light. So more than likely, if you get to this 20%, you will have a code to go on, and it's probably a lot easier. But if you're at 15%, 10%, you won't necessarily have a code. It depends on how the computer's programmed. So if you don't have a code to go on, but you'll see that fuel trim over 10%, I usually say double digits is a good rule of thumb to where you want to be concerned. You probably want to make the customer aware that they do have some sort of an issue with the vehicle, even if they're not complaining about it right now. Right, so that's always a good thing to keep in mind, right? So plus or minus 5 is good. Double digits, we worry. 20%, we got a light. And then here's just a little table to kind of bring it all together and what we're talking about. So we want to see ideally that stoichiometric air-fuel ratio, right? 14.7 to 1. So in that case, if we have a zirconia oxygen sensor, we'll see about 450 millivolts, because that is right down the middle of where we want to be. Fuel trim should be around about 0% because we don't need to make adjustments. That's where we want to be. And then it'll pulse the injector as it is programmed to pulse. So it'll be whatever the manufacturer decided that pulse needed to be at that load. If we have a lean condition in the engine, right? So the oxygen sensor notes that it is lean. So I have too much oxygen in my exhaust. So it'll go low. Lean is low. Rich is high. All right. So if it's a lean condition, it'll command for richer fuel. All right, I need more fuel to compensate for having less fuel. Lean condition means more air, less fuel. So I want to add fuel. My short-term fuel trim will go on the positive side. My long-term fuel trim would also go on the positive side. And then would increase the pulse with the injectors to add that fuel. Opposite end of the spectrum, rich condition. So if it's rich, there's not enough oxygen in the exhaust. So the oxygen sensor will react accordingly, and the voltage will go high. And then we will also get a lean command. Right, so lean out this mixture. I get way too much fuel in this mixture. Lean it out. So we'll see a negative short-term and long-term fuel trim as a result, because it's subtracting fuel. And then, like I said, decrease the pulse width for subtracting fuel there. So hopefully that brings it into a little bit clearer as to what we're talking about when we talk about fuel trims. And hopefully you can see how that might help guide you in some of these possible intermittent issues you might run into. Next, we have a quick little thing on catalyst efficiency. Because if I have a cat that is failing, but it has not failed enough to set a light, I might want to know that as well, especially if I might have a drivability problem in the vehicle. Right. So quick recap on how an oxygen or how a catalyst work. We have all the bad stuff come in. Right. So your hydrocarbons, carbon monoxide, oxides of nitrogen, and oxygen and oxides go in. First, it hits the reduction chamber, which will separate the oxygen from the NOx. Makes CO2, the carbon monoxide reduces the NOx and creates CO2. So we get carbon dioxide out of that. Then the oxidation chamber bonds the hydrocarbon and the carbon monoxide modules with oxygen and forms water, carbon dioxide, and nitrogen. So out my tailpipe, after all this is done, I get oxygen, I get carbon dioxide, I get water, and I get nitrogen. Right, so out of the four of those things, the only thing that's, kind of not that great, it would be carbon dioxide. But other than that, it's water, oxygen, and nitrogen, which we breathe anyways, right? So that's really basically how it works. And it's just a chemical reaction, right, based on what's inside. So how do I test that? How do I see how this vehicle is performing? Well, first off, we need to set up our screen, right? So I want to monitor my rear oxygen and my front oxygen or air fuel sensor, depending on how the vehicle is equipped. I also want to be able to be sure that I can keep it at a steady speed for at least a minute or two. And I want to make sure I have a steady throttle angle for that same period of time. All right, so in this case, looks like about here, which is about maybe frame 2400, up to about frame 3000, we have a steady speed of around 50 miles an hour, 49 to 50 miles an hour, right? So we want to keep it around that 50 mile an hour range. 45 to 50, I think you'd be okay. And you want to keep that steady throttle angle as well. The front oxygen sensor will be going up and down, or air fuel ratio sensor, depending on how it's equipped. It will be going up and down. This looks like it's not moving a lot because of the scaling, right? So it auto scales. So we have the super high and the super low ranges on this scale as well. So you will see it. It'll look more active if you're close in to see it. So we'll be going up and down a bit because it's adjusting, right? It's adjusting, hot, rich, lean, rich, lean. What we want to keep an eye on is the rear oxygen sensor. The rear oxygen sensor, of course, is after the cat. So this will tell us how the cat is working. If I'm driving down the road at a steady speed, at a steady load, with steady throttle, with really no change in that for a couple minutes, I should see a nice, smooth, straight line where that oxygen sensor is almost doing nothing. Looks like it might even be broken, right? It's just locked in place and it's not moving. So in this case, we got the higher voltage, about 0.8, and that is ideal. That's where we want to have it as long as the cat is working properly. We want to see a nice straight line up there. If my cat was failing, you would see that line be very active. It might even follow the front O2, right? If it's that bad where it's mirroring the front oxygen sensor and the rear oxygen sensor are doing the exact same thing, you probably would have a cat code at that point, but that's just a way to verify that the cat is even working. So if you do see activity on that rear O2 sensor when you're driving down the road at a steady state, the steady state is important because any fluctuation in that load on that engine will affect this sensor. So if we're just steady state cruise and we see a nice smooth line, cat's working. If we don't see a smooth line and we see it going up and down, cat's not working, right? And depending on how severe that gets is the severity of the deterioration of the cat. This is a vehicle with 157,000 miles on its original cats, by the way, so it's in good shape. Another thing we did here, which we can do, and it kind of correlates and adds to everything we've been talking about tonight, is I can also detect a lazy oxygen sensor by looking at this same data set. So if my oxygen sensor is not reacting fast enough, my fuel change won't react fast enough, right? So that could be a problem showing us that that sensor is going to fail or it has failed. So what we did here is you'll notice that my air fuel ratio sensor went up and my oxygen sensor went down in this case. And this is a point where my throttle position went to 0. So what we did is we cruised for a little while and then just did a full lift on the throttle, let it coast. It goes into fuel cut. So when it's in fuel cut, we're lean. On an AF sensor, lean is up. On a zirconia sensor, lean is down, right? So lean is low on a zirconia sensor. It's the opposite on an AF sensor. What is key is where do they react? So if I go over a little bit further, you'll notice the front sensor reacts first, and it should because it's first. Right? It's first in line. It's closest to the engine, so it should react first. And then we should see the rear O2 sensor react accordingly after. If the front sensor is lagging behind the rear sensor, which is a possibility, that indicates that it is not adjusting fast enough. It is what we call, you may have heard of a lazy oxygen sensor. It's not cycling where it needs to be. So you actually could do 2 tests in one just by doing this one catalyst test, right? So that's one thing we used to do at the dealership, and this was I thought it was just kind of cool that we could do this and we can see this information all on the screen just by using a scan tool. And any scan tool that can pull this data will be able to do that, right? So any of our tools should be able to do this. All right, and then as we see a little bit further where it goes full lean over there a little bit later. So the front sensor was definitely ahead of the rear sensor. All right, so now let's go live on the tool and see how we would approach a couple of these things, right? Because this is not a Toyota, this is a Tahoe, Chevy Tahoe. And let's see how we would approach this using a non-Toyota car for the freeze frame anyways, right? So if we look up here, first things first on any vehicle, no matter what we're trying to do, if it's a diagnosis, we want to do a code scan. We want to give that full vehicle health check. We want to check every single module for codes because we could have codes in modules that don't have lights. We could have history codes in there that aren't active at the time. So if I go into code scan there, I want to do a pre-scan because I haven't done anything yet. It's going to scan through all my different modules. Looks like I got 33 modules. Automatically saves the report for me. So it saves it to the tool, saves it to the cloud as well. And then I see I have 2 codes here. Now this is on a Zeus. So the Zeus, the Apollos, and the Triton all have intelligent diagnostics on them, right? So that gives us our diagnostic workflow we could walk through if we hit diagnose. But in this case, I want to look at that freeze frame, and that's in a different part of the tool. So in this example, it's on a Windows-based tool. So a Zeus or a Veris, all the modules on that code scan screen that we can access are underlined. That is a hyperlink. That is a quick link, and we can link directly into that module. On the non-Windows-based tools like the Apollo, the Solus, the Modus, etc., you can highlight this, and then there's a separate icon that you can click, and that will allow you to access the module as well. So let's go into Engine. Now you see when I'm in Engine, I have codes, I have clear codes, I have data, functional tests, and generic functions. I do not have a separate set for freeze frame like we did on the Toyota. So in order to go on a vehicle like this that does not have a built-in free OEM freeze frame, right, that's what that was. We can go into generic functions. What that'll do is it'll flip it from the OE side to the generic side of the computer. And then we have mode 2, OBD2 right here, freeze frame. And then it'll give us our freeze frame data for the code. So in this case, we have a PL101. So there's my settings at that time of the code, and we can use that for that information. So the vehicles that do not have multiple freeze frame will have single freeze frame. Right, so one freeze frame for whatever the last code was that's set. Okay, so let me exit out of that, back up out of here. Next thing I want to talk about is how would I do that CAT test? All right, so how would I go in there and do that catalytic converter test, and how would I manage the data with that? So I'm still in my engine. I can go into data display. Now, if we notice, as a 2016 Tahoe, we got a lot of data going on here, right? So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10, 15, 21 different sets of data, different data categories inside this PCM. I could probably find the oxygen sensors inside the main engine data, but we do have a separate oxygen sensor data, so let's go in there. It'll pull the data stream, of course, and then you see it's still a ton of data in here, even just related to the oxygen sensors, right? So I want to make this a little bit more manageable. So inside Snap-on Scan Tools, any Snap-on Scan Tool, we have this function called Custom Data List. So on the Windows tools, it looks like this. It says Custom on the top. It'll pull up and it'll allow us to filter down this list to just the items that we're looking for. So I'll deselect all of these that are selected. And then I want to look at my sensor 1 on, so those are my front oxygen sensors on both banks, rear oxygen sensors. And then if I go all the way down to the bottom, I know I have my vehicle speed, because we want to see what the vehicle speed is, steady state vehicle speed, and then my steady throttle position. Once I have all that, I want to be able to see this in a graph form, right? So I could go back to list view and open my graphs. Or from here, I could easily just go up and do a graph view as well. Now that's only on the Windows tool. But we can see in a graph view up to 16 PIDs on this one screen. So my throttle position, my vehicle speed, bank 2, front and rear, and then bank 1, front and rear. So that's how I would set that up. And so I could see just that information on the screen, get rid of all the rest of the stuff. I can see how my front and rear O2s are reacting. All right, so exit out of that. So that is my CAT test. Now let's switch gears a little bit. And remember how I said we'll talk about something a little bit different, that body module information. So if we think about, let's say that this vehicle came in and the customer complaint is, my rear wiper is not working. This is a Chevy Tahoe. It's an SUV. It's a fairly long SUV. So that wiper is way in the back of the car. How is this laid out? Where is my failure? Just from that information, where would we suspect the failure could be? Well, it could be a lot of things, right? It could be power supply. It could be the switch. Could be the module. Could be the motor. Could be that big long harness that goes from the module in the front of the car all the way back to the motor. Do I want to start disassembling interior body panels? Probably not. Not the best course of action, because that's going to take you a while and you don't necessarily know what you're chasing. You can use data and functional tests in order to figure this out from the driver's seat without having to pull any panels. So let's go into our body control module here. And we can go into data display and check the data, or we can go into functional tests. Now, the nice thing about Snap-on Scan Tools, again, is if we go into functional tests, we also see data at the same time. So we can kind of go through and kill two birds with one stone, so to speak. So we'll go into functional tests, and that would be an output control. So I can look on my list, and do I see the rear wiper? So it should be here. There it is right there in the middle, rear wiper. So I'll go into my rear wiper. And as I said, we do see data display when we go into a functional test. Now, it is nice that we give you the data in a functional test. Like I said, it is exclusive to Snap-on, but what it does do is it gives us the first data set. So if I have 12 or 13 different sets of data in there, like we saw on the engine, it's going to just pull up the first one. In this, it looks like I have a bunch of switches, right? Auto transmission switch, brake pedal, a lot of brake switches, right? Park switches, stop lamps, etc. I want to see my wiper data. So in here, we have another function that we don't talk a lot about, but it's been in here for a while, is change the list. So I want to change my list, and you see 1, 2, 3, 4, 8, 6, 17 different lists we can choose from. I'm going to go to my wiper and washer data. Go in there, and then here is my data stream with just my wiper information. Now, once again, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 14 different data PIDs. I want to whittle that down even more. So we'll go and do a custom data list on this. Deselect all. I just want to see my rear wiper switch and my rear wiper command. That's all I'm concerned about. I'll go back to my list. So rear wiper command is going to tell me that the module has commanded the rear wiper on. The rear wiper switch is going to tell me I see the wiper switch telling me to turn it on or off, right? So this wiper switch is an input as far as the module is concerned. And the wiper command is an output as far as the module is concerned. So we need to keep that in mind. So all we need to do, the first thing I would do, and you could do it either way, what we're going to do is we're splitting the circuit in half. So it could be the switch, could be the wiring between the switch and the module, could be the module, could be the module, the wiring between the module and the wiper, or it could be the wiper motor. So first thing I want to do is I want to turn that wiper motor on, tell the module to command the wiper motor on, and see what happens. So all I have to do is hit on. This is just a demo vehicle, so the data doesn't change, but we would see that it commanded it on. If it has commanded it on, if it shows on here, then I know that the module can send the command. And then all I have to do is use my eyes and ears to see, does the wiper come on? And let's say in this case, in this scenario we're talking about, I click on and the rear wiper comes on. So now what's the problem? Well, I know it's not the module, right? Because it's able to send the output. I know I don't need to rip off body panels and chase that harness all the way from the module all the way back to the rear wiper, because I just verified that it can turn it on. And then I also don't need to worry about pulling off the back panel and checking the motor, because the motor's working, right? Because it was able to send the signal and it responded to the signal, and now I have a rear wiper. So let's say in this case, that's what happened. So now I just cut my workload way down because I don't have to worry about that. Now what we can do, and we can do it from this same screen, is turn on the wiper switch. If I move the rear wiper switch to on or intermittent or what have you, and I don't see a change in this data PID, that means that the body control module is not seeing the signal from the switch. All right, so let's say in this scenario, we turn the switch on manually with our hand, right, on the multifunction switch, and nothing. It sees nothing. So now I have it narrowed down to, it could be the switch, it could be the harness between the switch and the module. And then I suppose it could possibly be the module not seeing the signal. So next thing we would do is, of course, we could test the switch and we can test the harness to make sure that we have good contact between the two. And let's say that the harness was good and the switch was bad. So we replace the switch. Easy enough to check, right? We plug everything in, we turn it on, and see if the wiper turns on with the switch. But we also could verify, does the module see the switch input, which it would if it's working, and then does it give the rear wiper command out? You know, and in that case, that would be good. All right. So that's one scenario. Let's flip it around real quick and think about the opposite of that scenario. So let's say I command it on, or say it's off, and then I command it on and nothing happens. Maybe it does still say it's commanded on, so that means the module's at least getting the signal. That's okay. But now my wiper's not working. So in that case, it could be the motor, it could be the harness. So I'd have to investigate that area. And then I could also double check with the switch. So let's say I flip the switch says on in the data, and then it commands it on in the body control module. That means the switch is good, harness between the switch and the module is good, and the module's good. So now we just got to figure out why the wiper's not working. Right? So by splitting our circuit in half, and this can work on multitude of things on a vehicle, engine stuff, body stuff, whatever, if we can split the circuit in half and use data and functional tests to tell, that's going to save you a ton of time in your diagnosis as well.
if you haven't heard yet, if you own a Snap-on scan tool that can install 22.4, which is the current update that just came out 2 weeks ago, you can be entered to win this Epic. This is an Epic diagnostic workstation. It's a 36-inch Epic cabinet, and then we have the locker, or the I always forget this, the riser on the top. The riser on the top, and in that riser will be a Zeus Plus, and a dock and a 27-inch touchscreen, so you can go and use it and have a bigger screen to see. So if maybe you're in your car or something like that, you'd be able to see it that way. So this is a very epic prize. We're giving away 10 of these, one per region in North America. So if you're outside of North America, I don't know if they're doing another contest, but I don't know what it is if they are. So this is for North America only. We're giving away 10 because we have 10 regions in North America, Canada and the United States. So it is this custom wrap on there, and it will have your name on it. If you win, you will get your name emblazoned on that draw right there. And like I said, pretty easy to win. All you need to do is, if you're running a Snap-on scan tool, just make sure it's got the current software on it, it's 22.4, by the end of the day on December 31st. You got a software subscription, might as well just do it now. It downloads to the tool automatically, just install it. You got a data plan on your tool, just install the latest update, as long as your data plan hasn't expired. Or if you don't have either of those, you can always start a subscription, or you could buy a single software title from your franchisee. Also, if you did the buy one, get one free a couple months ago, where you could buy 22.2 and get 22.4 for free, install your free update. Any of those things, as long as your tool has 22.4 on the tool, when we run the report first week of January, which would be by December 31st, we're going to make sure everybody can get in that thing. And then we'll run it a few days later and just say, okay, everybody up until December 31st, do a random drawing. And if you get picked, you win. $24,000 toolbox. Crazy, right? With a Zeus Plus inside. I think this is an awesome contest. I wish I could win it, but I can't. So 10 regions though. So if you have a lot of people updating your region, your odds are a little lower. If you have not a lot of people updating your region, then your odds are higher. So it's definitely going to vary by region. Just make sure you get that software installed and you are entered to win. Pretty cool. So next week, we'll be talking about advanced lighting systems. This is an all new course we're going to put out starting next week. Same time, same place, 6 and 9 Eastern. If you want to register for Zoom, go to snapon.com/OT. You can register there. Also, the 6 p.m. Eastern class goes to YouTube. So if you're on YouTube, please like and subscribe. And you can go check out youtube.com/Snap-on Diagnostics for that. And then 9 p.m. Eastern class goes to my Facebook page. So on Facebook, it's facebook.com/SnapOnJason, all one word, no dash in the Snap-on. So we'll be talking about HID bulbs, LEDs, projector lighting, moving lighting, as they have with ADAS functions and whatnot this week. So it should be an interesting class. Make sure you join me then. Also, if you're interested in any of our other prior topics, things like ADAS, data bus testing, component testing series we did, VVT, any of those classes are also available on our YouTube channel. Once again, youtube.com/Snap-on Diagnostics. There's a playlist for live training, and you can watch any of our 50 previous topics. And with that, we're up to Q&A. Now, as I said, this is a pre-recorded session this week. So if you do have any questions, if you're watching on Zoom, just reply to the confirmation email. That'll go to my email inbox. If you're watching on YouTube, just leave a comment under the video, and we'll help you out when we can. And then same thing with Facebook, leave a comment under the video, and I will get to those as we go throughout. Also want to make sure I mention my buddy Al, who also does free diagnostic training. He does tool-specific training. So if you want to get a little bit more knowledge as to what your tool can do, how it works, Monday it's on Apollo, Wednesday it's on Zeus, and Thursday it's on Triton. So very thorough class, all the way from let's make sure your Wi-Fi set up, make sure that's all set and going, because a lot of features on the tool actually need Wi-Fi nowadays. And that's through the manufacturer even. All the way through, let's set up your free Snap-on Cloud account so you can upload and share files. And then we'll go through code to completion, fast track intelligent diagnostics. How does it help me as a technician diagnose vehicles faster? And then that's about an hour long for all that. Each night, depending on what tool it is, he'll just do it on the respective tool. Wednesday and Thursday, though, since those tools also have scope and meter functions, take a 5-minute break after that first hour. Then he goes through another hour on the scope and the meter and real world examples of where you would use that and what it would look like, fuel pumps, things of that nature. So same time, same place, Monday, Wednesday, or Thursday, pick your tool, snapon.com/OT. He only goes to Zoom, so you'll need to be, it's more of an in-person type session. Your camera's not on, but he'll be able to answer your questions. You type them in the Q&A. He's definitely, able to answer your questions live, and it's kind of designed to have the tool in front of you following along with what he's doing on the screen. So once again, go check him out, snapon.com/OT. It's free. With that, thank you very much for your time today. Thank you for taking a little bit of time out of your busy week to come join us. Thank you very much, and we'll see you next week. Have a good night.